Yes, hello. My name is Tim Noble. I work with Heriot-Watt University and ICIT here in Stromness. But in 2005 through to 2009, I worked with VSO on overseas development projects and in the island of Vanuatu, the archipelago of Vanuatu in particular. And so I'm giving this talk today called A Paradise Lost as part of the Distant Shores exhibition, which has just finished at the Stromness Museum. So if I share my screen, sharing and sharing, you should now be able to see the poster which advertised this wonderful exhibition, which runs through 2020 and 2021, but has recently closed. But it celebrated the connections between Orkney and Oceania, which are quite extensive and complex. But before I go on, I'd just like to say a brief word about VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. VSO recruited me to work as a professional in Vanuatu as an employee of the Vanuatu government, looking at the level of government between the newly formed central parliament in Port Vila, the capital, following independence in 1980, and all the villages scattered on the islands throughout the archipelago. So it's really to help develop a middle level of government, a provincial or local authority level of government, providing services like transport and development and education and health. And VSO is a development organization in its own right. It's funded partly by the British government and some overseas governments, and also by voluntary donation. And basically it employs professionals who will volunteer, perhaps medics, perhaps teachers, perhaps administrators, perhaps engineers, to assist in overseas development around the world. A really terrific organization, which is hard up for funds at the moment, so having been cut under this government. So if you feel like donating, please do, and I can give you the details if you come to me later on. So where are we? We're in the Pacific, and these three large cultural groups of Micronesians, Melanesians, and Polynesians, who have all derived from groups of people moving down from the north, from Taiwan area, and then spreading out across the Pacific Ocean, also back across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar. And the timing of the various cultural groups is spread out over millennia. The Melanesian group, probably the oldest, running through Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, down to Vanuatu, and New Caledonia. And that dates back 2,000, 3,000 years BC, whereas the Polynesian culture reached Easter Island, the extreme east of the area, probably only around about 1200 AD. So we're looking at a big time span and a gradual spreading out of these populations through this scattering of islands in the South Pacific, sometimes known as Paradise, but we'll come back to that as we talk. Here's the archipelago of Vanuatu. It's a Y-shaped archipelago spread out over 1,200 kilometers from north to south, from something above 16 degrees south to below 20 degrees south, from purely tropical through to almost temperate kinds of regions, but very large distances, with a population initially of bush-loving people who kept themselves to themselves, villages in the bush. They may only know a couple of villages away, and certainly not the other islands. And one of the most diverse language regions of the world, with about 105 languages recorded across the archipelago. The village languages, which have since been boosted by French and by English and by Bislama, which is an Anglo-French pidgin, which is now the national language of Vanuatu. So the island I was based on was the island of Malakula, which is the one that sits there looking like a sitting dog, the second largest island in the group. And that province of Malakula, together with the neighboring island of Ambrim and Palma, has a population of around about 40,000 people in an overall population of around about 250, 300,000 in this day. So let's have a closer look. That is the island I was based on, that's Malakula, with the three main settlements. Lakatoro up in the northeast there, which is the capital. And I live quite close there. And then down in the southeast, the settlement of the map, and in the southwest corner, Southwest Bay, or the township of Wintua. And so let's look at the people. A jolly picture to start with. This is a group of people in Malakula, quite a large group of people who are marching to a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Vanuatu Republic becoming independent from the colonial partners of Britain and France, which happened in 1980. So the archipelago was colonized jointly by Britain and France in about 1900, quite late. And if you can imagine Britain and France working together in anything, you can imagine what the government was like. And it was known as the condominium government, or otherwise as known as the pandemonium government. And the population of Vanuatu is divided into Anglophone and Francophone communities. Each were separately administered in the colonial era. And that is inclusive of on islands as well. So the area we were just looking at, the map, is a Francophone area. Lakatoro is an Anglophone area. So the languages spoken by the people today are either their village language, English if they're an Anglophone area, French if they're a Francophone area, or the Anglo-French pidgin of Bislama, which developed, which has become the national language. A grimmer picture, because over the period of the 19th century, for over 100 years, probably lasting through until 1930s in Vanuatu, death stalked the land. It was a very grim time for both the residents and the settlers. The population of Vanuatu before settlement, before the Europeans arrived, was thought to be about 1 million people. But by 1935, it was less than 50,000 people. And the main problem there had been epidemics, diseases brought by these visitors, against which the islanders had no defense. This particular gravestone is of Dorothy Isabel Fleming, who was the wife of a missionary. And throughout the islands, you'll find these sad little groups of gravestones with very often whole families dying before their time in what was quite a difficult area to be. But moving on, and beach. The beach, it's the frontier, isn't it? It's where the battles took place. It's where the islanders met the outside world and the outside world met the islanders. So if we look back at that history in Vanuatu and in Malakula in particular, the first European to arrive or recorded to arrive was Pedro Fernandez de Quiros, who arrived in here in 1606. A Portuguese explorer employed by the Spanish king to find Australia, and he found the islands. And then quite big gaps over the 17th century into the 18th century when more explorers arrived. And James Cook arrived here with HMS Resolution on his second voyage in the late 18th century, and de Bougainville arrived a few years later. But it was in the 19th century that trade started to develop and economic exploitation of the islands commenced, resulting eventually in settlement. So it was around about 1825, 1830 that the sandalwood traders were the first to arrive, harvesting stands of sandalwood throughout the islands. But soon after, the blackbirders, the recruiters of labor for the Queensland sugar fields, arrived in a pretty dismal episode of history when what was effectively slavery took these islanders to Queensland to work in the sugar fields in very poor conditions. And this is where the pidgin language really developed, where they had to communicate with people from outside their villages. And the Bislama language was formed. And then the missionaries, after around about 1850, Christian missionaries, first of all Presbyterian and Catholic, but later other denominations, came to the islands to spread their message of Christianity. And the islands today are essentially 99% probably Christian, 99.9% perhaps Christian, but linked somewhat uncomfortably to traditional beliefs of ancestor worship and grave taking, and somehow they merge together, but a strong Christian tradition which exists to this day. And then the settlers arrived in the late 18th century, bringing coconuts and cattle and other agricultural produce to exploit the land for agricultural purposes, eventually leading to colonization around about 1900 in this Anglo-French condominium government. At the time, there were about 2,000 French and about 1,000 British settlers. And then eventually independence in 1980, something that Britain was very keen to have. They wanted to leave. France was rather more reticent about it. And still today, the French influence and the French presence in Vanuatu is much stronger than the British. A bit of coast. This is close to the airport at Noosa, but a fairly typical bit of coast with mangrove groves around the edge, sandy beaches, volcanic hills in the background, densely forested, dense rainforest, and a nice smooth lagoon on a warm day near Lakatoro. One of my favorite beaches. I would come here with a book on a Sunday on what would seemingly be a deserted beach for a quiet Sunday morning, but no sooner had I sat down and I could hear rustling in the bush behind me, and children would appear from nowhere and sit in a ring around me and just stare. And I attended conversations in Bislama, and then maybe their parents would arrive and bring small gifts of food or what have you, and it would soon become quite a social event. And then thinking about transport, islands everywhere depend so much on their transport and their transport links. We know that here in Orkney. This is the ferry, which is supposed to come in once a week, but often only came in about once every 3 weeks, on which most people depend for the movement of people, for the movement of goods, for exports, to and from the island. Their main form of contact for most people in the community is this ferry. Quite frequently materials run out. Oil and diesel might run out, and the islands would be without for maybe a week, but they're used to it and have found ways of dealing with that. Because we're looking at an island here, Malakula in particular, where there are no paved roads, there is no electricity, apart from the odd small generator. There is no piped water, and there are very few public services for the community to depend on. There is a great dependence on the village and what is a wealthy subsistence economy, but the cash economy is extremely basic, with few opportunities for cash crops. And this is the air service. So this is a de Havilland Twin Otter short takeoff plane, which is the workhorse of the islands around Vanuatu, carrying cargo and people. I would nip up and down to the capital in Port Vila on the island of Efate, about an hour's flight away on this Twin Otter. It would carry quite a lot of cargo, and in the passenger cabin, I would often be accompanied by trussed up pigs on the floor, a crate of chickens, perhaps a couple of dogs for good measure. But it is the absolute workhorse of the islands. And then for road transport, well, there's the main road. You can see how difficult road travel is on these kinds of roads. These four-wheel drive trucks are the essential workhorse of the road transport. This one is working as a bus. People cram in to the back. It travels when it can. It might be held up for reasons of weather. It might be held up for reasons of breakdown, but eventually it will run. And somehow the message gets out, the bus is running on this island. It's 100 miles long, the island. So quite big distances to travel over these very, very poor roads. And this is the Pancuma River, and this is the main road across the Pancuma River. So it's necessary to ford across the river. And when you arrive at one side, you have to judge, and I was always in my four-wheel drive truck, judge whether or not the water was low enough to allow a vehicle to pass. This one has got stuck, as they frequently did, but it's just one of the many hurdles which have to be overcome. And then this is my truck. This is my four-wheel drive Mitsubishi L200. This is my pride and joy. It was the newest truck on the island, and sporting the European flag on the door, because my post there, as I said, I was recruited by VSO, I was employed by the government of Vanuatu, but I was funded by the European Union. And this is the truck they provided me with, which eventually went to the Public Works Department. And there's a group of Public Works employees in the back, and I'm taking them off to one of their work sites somewhere. The truck enabled me to meet and greet people to get around in this island where it's very difficult to get around, but I was able to get around, to go out to the villages, to meet people. I was always in demand to give lifts, which I was very happy to do. So I gave lifts to the magistrate going out to his various courts. I gave lifts to the Public Works Department, as I'm doing here. I gave lifts to people traveling towards the hospital. And I should have said, there is a hospital on the island for these 40,000 people who live in the province, but there are no doctors and just a couple of nurse practitioners. So when someone's traveling in from a village to the hospital, then they need private transport. I can't rely on a bus. And so I was very happy if I found someone who was traveling to the hospital to take them in and to talk about their lives and to learn a bit more about life on the islands. That's my truck. So here I'm actually traveled out to one of the villages up in the hills. Pretty isolated, very isolated villages, very difficult to reach. You need the four-wheel drive to get there. Not very much happens in the villages. Any new presence, any visitor is greeted by hordes of children, usually, who come running out just to see something different, something new. So these villages constructed very much from bush materials. There's a little here in the way of concrete or modern building materials. It's all bush materials, everything's ephemeral. I would come out here, I would meet with the village elders, I would meet with the village chief and talk about the problems of the village and getting support and getting public services. I have to say the European flag on the side of my truck always raised the expectation of my bringing something more tangible. But unfortunately, I couldn't do that. But I was there to talk about government and governance rather than being able to give them something really tangible they needed, like a doctor, like a health centre, like a hospital, like a nurse, like good roads or electricity. I couldn't provide them with that, sadly. But very happy people, always pleased to see me and always looked after me extremely, extremely well. Here's a village market for the women mainly, who would come and trade vegetables and fruits, perhaps some chicken that they have grown. Fruit and vegetables in their gardens. They'd have a garden plot and they come and trade in the market, if possible to sell for cash, but not very much cash around to enable that. And the women here were wearing the traditional, well, semi-traditional, because of course it's quite a recent innovation, Mother Hubbard dresses. These were designed, you won't be surprised to hear, by missionaries in the 19th century, early 20th century, who were horrified at the apparent state of undress of the people on the island and designed this rather shapeless, but can be extremely attractive form of dress, which most of the women will wear, and even the young girls, as you can see from that girl on the left there. So that's one of the very many village markets. And this is a friend of mine, Nywens, who worked with us at the village council. And this is her house in the village of Mai with her two children, Cliff and Maureen. I'm not quite sure about the little boy in the orange t-shirt, he's just a visitor. And this is their dining area. And you can see how their house is built from very traditional materials, bush materials, with everything ephemeral, although they have managed to get hold of some corrugated tin for the roof, but that's the only modern material there to be seen. And here are two women also in the village of Mai, who are preparing the traditional food of Lap Lap. This is a paste of starch foods like taro and yam and manioc, which are ground up and a well made in the middle to put chicken and coconut milk in, and then the whole lot is wrapped in banana leaves and buried in a rock oven and baked for several hours before being brought out and unwrapped, and the whole village or group of people will sit around and break off pieces of food in what is a very social eating occasion. It's a very bland food, I have to say, but nonetheless, it's nutritious and it is filling. And then here's a group of villagers, a family perhaps, grouped around a television set. As I said, there's no electricity on the island, but there are the odd little generator. And most villages will now have a small generator and a television set and a satellite dish, which enables them to see the outside world for the first time. And that is a mixed blessing because it raises expectations. Life in the village, in this wealthy subsistence economy, is pretty secure for all the lack of its public services, and it can be brutal, but it is secure. Seeing the outside world, raising expectations, particularly for the young men who want to move away, perhaps to go to the capital in Port Vila on the island of Ifate, where there is a highly developed cash economy, mainly because it's the home of diplomats and development workers who bring in cash. But there's a new kind of employment and a new kind of life there. And also a life outside of Vanuatu, which is very difficult to reach and very hard to prosper in. But with this kind of technology, of course, people want to share in something better to what they have known, or seemingly better to what they have known in their villages working with a subsistence economy. Just a pretty village street outside the shop. This is down towards Lamap. And now turning to the economy. This is a coconut grove. So these coconut palms, very tall coconut palms, are probably 75 to 80 years old and are beyond their normal working life. About 70 years is the life of a coconut palm. But this is what the colonialists left behind, and they haven't been able to replace them. The tractor is towing a load of coconut, which are going for processing, particularly into copra, which is dried coconut meat, which is exported, but quite a low value product. And the whole coconut business has really changed completely with the development of new species, and which are more productive and perhaps more low growing, so they can be picked from the ground, and developed in places like Sri Lanka and southern India, which are also closer to markets. Here we have quite low productivity coconut groves, very remote from markets, very difficult to produce a really worthwhile cash crop, and in desperate need of investment, not only in the crop itself, but also in the means of marketing and exporting to places where they are in demand. But the coconut grows up quite beautiful. I drive along this road at night, and where there were fences, every single fence post would have a barn owl sitting on it. The barn owls are after the rats who wander around after the coconuts, and the barn owls are after them, but hugely beautiful, attractive birds to see at night in number. And then cattle, organic cattle. These two brought in by the settlers and colonialists, mainly for use on the archipelago of Vanuatu itself, unable to export huge numbers to countries like Australia, and big countries like Australia and New Zealand nearby, of course, have their own more productive cattle farms, and still being rounded up on horses here, which was wonderful to see. But they're turned out to graze amongst the coconut palms. And then a more modern crop, and one that holds more promise. This is cacao. These are cocoa beans which are drying before they go for final processing. I don't know if you know the whole process, but the pods are picked from the trees, and the beans are then fermented for a period of time and then laid out to dry before they go processing for chocolate or cocoa powder. This particular facility is a drying facility which has been constructed under a French project, Polpaca. It's a really very good project to see because it's a highly integrated project. It not only looks at the production of the cocoa beans in the field and then the picking, but also the processing, the export, and the marketing and the retailing of this product. So in France, you can find Vanuatu chocolate, which is part of this project, which has not only helped at the local level in getting production underway, but has taken it right the way through to retailing a product in France, which can earn cash. And this is one of many projects the French are involved in Vanuatu. They've retained their interests as a bilateral donor, whereas the British have not and have largely pulled out. The tourism industry, it actually is on the neighboring island of Santo. Something perhaps lies in the future, but the drawback for Malakula as well. Santo is a more developed island than Malakula, mainly because it was an American base during World War II. So they have hard roads, they have an electricity grid, they have piped water, and they have one or two hotels of this standard to attract in tourists. The problem for tourism in this part of the world, and for Malakula in particular, is that the transport links are so bad. They're beautiful islands, they have so much to offer. But for tourists who have 2 weeks holiday, and they have to rely on being able to get there and to get out again, to be trapped because the plane hasn't come or the ferry hasn't come, is a disaster because they can't get back to work. So it's not only the facilities on the islands in the way of infrastructure, but it's also the transport links, which can be secure and regular enough to guarantee people that can get in and they can get out again. So this one, as I say, is on the neighboring island of Santo. This is Walla Island, which is a small island just off Malakula. And this pier is where the cruise passengers come in from mainly Australian cruise boats. They don't bring anything to the island. A few trinkets are sold, and some custom traditional dancing is done, which brings in a little bit of cash. But basically, the cruise boats come with completely self-contained with food and accommodation, and they don't bring very much in to the islands, apart from a group of people who really don't know where they are and totally inappropriately dressed. I mentioned earlier on the extreme modesty of the dress of most of the women in Vanuatu as a result of these missionary designed mother hubbard dresses. The tourists coming off the cruise boats dressed in thongs, which is totally inappropriate, although it causes a great deal of amusement to the islanders that these peculiar people have turned up wearing next to nothing, rather reversal of what the Victorians would have found when they came in the 19th century. And then this is a traditional village dance, which is only put on now for tourists. So this is something that's been laid on for a group of visiting cruise boat passengers and brings in a little bit of cash. And then music, the traditional Vanuatu string band, guitars, ukuleles, and probably a tea-chest bass, like the old skiffle groups, talking about happenings on the island, singing in Bislama, this pidgin language, which one of the few languages, foreign languages, in which I've become fluent. Admittedly, just French and English words, but you have to know which words, and when you speak it very fast, it is hard to pick up. But in the time I was there, in my 3-4 years, I was able to become pretty fluent in it, which enabled me to go out to the villages and talk to the chiefs and the elders and the communities about their lives and their priorities for local government. More in the cultural sense, this is sand drawing. Again, one of the traditional art features of the islands, sand drawing, these very complex patterns in the sand, but of course they're ephemeral. Like most of the art and the art materials on the islands, they don't last long. They all come from the bush and they break down quite quickly. These are children in the museum in Port Vila, just working with the tradition of sand drawing. And then this is the Provincial Council. These are the people I worked with in seeking to build and develop this local government, this bridge between the new Parliament in Port Vila after independence and all the villages with their chiefly system of justice and their chiefly system of management, introducing this middle level which could become involved in the sort of things the council are working with here, with education, with health, with development and social services, which are almost non-existent, apart from the security of the village, of course, but very informal. There's some kind of celebration going on. I can't remember what it was, but a pig has been slaughtered as a gift. There is a carver root there, which is used to make a somewhat narcotic drink, which is very popular in the islands, and there's a yam being given away. Most of the people there are village chiefs in their own right, or the representatives of village chiefs. The man second from the left in the check shirt, Palin, he's a professional administrator who has been to university in Australia and brings a very high level of competence of administration to this developing local authority. A man who's going to go far and undoubtedly will enter politics in Vanuatu at some stage in his life. And then this is a family who've been employed by a wildlife NGO to protect turtles, to bring some turtles through to a point where they can be released and have a better chance of survival in the sea. So they collect the eggs and hatch the turtles and then bring them up to a level where they can be released. But this is another form of employment for them, for the family, with cash coming in from an overseas NGO to assist with turtle conservation. And then this highlights the very high natural disaster risk in the islands. I did mention the word paradise a little while ago, this reputation the islands had for being a paradise. And one can imagine for a European sailor having been at sea for months, living on hardtack in very difficult conditions, arriving here into this wealthy subsistence economy, which is warm but not too hot, which is moist but not too wet, with ample food and very friendly people. It did seem like paradise, but of course it's not. There are no public services, and there's a very high degree of natural disaster risk. What we're looking at here is the volcano on Lopevi, little island close to Malekula. It has recently erupted. The eruption's dying down, but there's a wee gas cloud there left. And the United Nations have a rating of natural disaster risks for all the countries in the world. And Vanuatu is number one from a point of view of volcanoes, earthquakes, cyclones, and tsunamis. They're at very high risk. And the recent events in Tonga, of course, highlight that risk very close by, just 1,000 kilometers away, probably a little over. And the tsunami from the Tongan eruption certainly hit Vanuatu, but Vanuatu's fortunate in having a lot of high ground to retreat to in this strongly volcanic group of islands, as opposed to some of the low-level islands like Tuvalu and Kiribati, who suffer much more from sea level rise and from tsunami. And then thinking about education and development. There's a very high level of attendance at schools, but schools are not free. School fees have to be paid. And a constant battle of parents in Malekula is raising enough money for their children to attend school almost on a week-by-week basis. If they have money, they go to school. If they don't have the money for the fees, they're kept at home. And in terms of future opportunities, of course, getting a good education raises expectation of getting good jobs to go to. But again, the opportunities are limited. Some will be lucky and find good jobs in Vanuatu, perhaps in Afate, and at the capital, Port Vila. Very few will have the opportunity to travel outside of Vanuatu to gain visas to attend perhaps university in Australia or in New Zealand. But most will find from their education that the opportunities are close to them until the economies can develop more. And let's talk about development. There are a number of external donors who are interested in Vanuatu, partly for altruistic reasons, but mainly for strategic reasons. Vanuatu is extremely strategically placed between other parts of Asia and Australia and New Zealand, and for United States. So there is competition here between donors. in particular China and the United States, to maintain strategic advantage and not to let one side or the other get more strategic advantage. But the other major donors after China, the United States, are Japan, France, Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, but sadly not Britain. Britain here, who was the colonial power and still has a pretty good reputation amongst islanders for one reason or another. They like British people. They're not so keen on Australians, who are the big neighbours. But while I was there, the British High Commission was closed, and Britain's affairs are now managed by New Zealand. But France has held on in there. You know, France has a different relationship with its old colonies. They're regarded as part of France, and France is still a significant bilateral donor. Britain's put its money in through the European Union, but after Brexit, I don't know what the plans are for maintaining some kind of facility for the archipelago of Vanuatu. Of the group of people standing here, the man in the short sleeve white shirt with the dark trousers is Santo, who is the Prime Minister. And behind him in the grey suit with a garland around his neck is the Minister for Public Works. And this is a Japanese delegation. They're standing on a pier that was built with Japanese funds and considering an extension to help with ferry and boat services to the islands. Another kind of aid, this is a private trust, the Malakula Medical Relief Trust, which is run by Paul, who is sitting at the wheel there of the truck. Paul is a New Zealand building contractor and has put his own money and has raised funds in New Zealand for this private trust to bring medical facilities and medical relief into Malakula. And there are a number of similarly small trusts who come along and help in small ways with work in the islands. Sometimes a visiting yacht, for example, which brings nurses and doctors in to hold a few surgeries, but they are only there for a short time. Paul and his people are strongly committed to Malakula over a number of years and have bases there. Here's cement coming into the islands over that Japanese pier we looked at to help with construction. And here is a celebration to accept from the European Union that road building machinery, which you can see in the background. And the women of the island are lined up with garlands to welcome the Prime Minister and the European Union representative to accept this gift of road making equipment for the islands. And the phrase there, in God we build Malampa, this strong Christian background to everything. And I don't think while I was there that I went to a single event or even a meeting, a small meeting, or a celebration or any kind of happening where a prayer wasn't said at the beginning and was said at the end as well. So still very much part of everyday life as opposed to reserved for special occasions in Malakula and in Vanuatu. This is a bit of road building going on. A small road to a village up in the bush. This is being funded by the United States as part of their program. This is a small water supply scheme actually being run and managed by the community. To get here, we trekked through extremely dense bush up the hill, where they built a small holding tank, which will then pipe water through a small 20mm, 3/4 inch line down to the village to bring the vestige of a piped water supply for the first time to the village. And just show this because two friends, Jean-Pierre and Richard, on the island of Tanna. This is a similar ceremony to the one I showed just now in Malakula, where the European Union are presenting road building equipment to this time to the people of Tanna Island, and they're dressed in their best to celebrate the day. And in the evening we had a barbecue. Rather disconcertingly, I was invited to choose the goat that we would be slaughtered and barbecued for the evening meal. I was taken to an enclosure full of goats and told, well, which one should we eat? Which is, yes, a little bit too close to me, but anyway, we had an enjoyable celebration and a good day as part of that ceremony. Just very briefly, a few words about my foreign colleagues, the other expatriates on Malakula. We were not many in this population of nearly 40,000 people across the province. There were only about 12 expatriates and foreigners living on the island. We had visitors, of course, but they tended to fly in the morning and look to get a flight out in the afternoon or the next morning. They would not stay long. But we were the resident foreigners, and most of the group here, how many we've got? We've got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, plus me, 9 or 10 people here out of a population of 12. Most of them here are young American Peace Corps volunteers who I am so impressed by. These youngsters were such fun. They were liberal, they were well educated, they were well read. They lived in the bush, in the villages, whereas I had a nice concrete house in Lakatoro with at least a generator and sort of pipe water supply. These guys were living out in the bush under very difficult conditions and helping the villages with doing things in the schools and helping with sport and things like that. So most of them are Peace Corps. The three exceptions, extreme right at the back is Bruce, is an Australian who's been brought in by the Vanuatu government to resurrect an old coca plantation, which had been funded by the British, but went into dereliction. And next to him is Joyce. I'll say a couple more words about Joyce at the moment. And the guy looking back at me from the left, we saw him in his truck before, is Paul, who actually doesn't stay on Malakula, but is from New Zealand and runs the Malakula Medical Relief Trust. And we've had a grand meal at Bruce's house and enjoyed some Tusker beers, which is the local brew. So we had a pretty good social life as well to work with. All of it in the open air, which was fantastic. Joyce and Mary visiting a woman who's just had a wee baby there out in the village, and you can see again the sort of construction of the village houses. And then this is Joyce. Joyce was a fellow VSO volunteer who left the island of Malakula soon after I arrived to take up a management post with VSO in Port Vila, in the capital, and she's just receiving her parting gift and wearing the traditional Mother Hubbard dress. And she was then on her way back to the mainland, but she's one of many people, and women in particular, who I admire tremendously for putting themselves in some very difficult situations. Joyce went on to work with Oxfam and other development agencies in places like Gaza, Myanmar, Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Ghana. And so living and working in extremely difficult situations and bringing relief to communities who are under a lot of pressure and extremely vulnerable communities. I met up with Joyce this Christmas in Edinburgh, and we went out for dinner, and it was great to catch up. And I have a little story to tell about this picture. This group of people are walking out to the plane. This is the airport terminal at Southwest Bay, Wintour. And I got off the plane to stretch my legs while the other passengers come out to join the flight up to Lakatoro. And in the hills behind the terminal is the grave of Bernard Deacon. Some of you know who Bernard Deacon was. He was the very good friend of Margaret Gardner, who founded the Peer Arts Centre here in Stromness, and is one of these links between Orkney, Stromness, and Malakula in particular, and Vanuatu in general. The other is Jack Renton, and there's another story about him, but sticking particularly to the story of Bernard Deacon, he and Margaret may or may not have been going to get married, but it seemed likely. They were extremely close friends. Bernard was an anthropologist. He came to Malakula in 1926 to investigate the people here and the community. And Bernard was pretty convinced that the whole population of the islands of Vanuatu were going to disappear. The indigenous population was going to be completely wiped out. If you remember at the time, it's gone from 1 million to this time down to less than 50,000. And he fears for the future of the islanders. And Margaret went back to the islands in 1983. She was invited back by the government of Vanuatu to visit Bernard's grave, because sadly, just before he was about to leave in 1928, he fell ill with blackwater fever and died. And he's never got to, Margaret was waiting for him in Australia. He never got back. And his grave, as I say, is just there. And Margaret was invited out to visit the grave in 1983. And she wrote this book, Footprints on Malakula, as a memoir of Bernard Deacon, which records a lot of their letters to each other. And I just want to read from one short section of it that Bernard wrote in 1928, shortly before he left, talking about the deaths in the villages of so many of the indigenous people. And he said this. He said, "They die so simply, unassumingly, uncomprehendingly, and all with this tragic swiftness. In one village of 20, 9 died in 1 week. Men had become carelessly ironic about death. It's not like death in war or crisis. It is the final death, the death of a people, a race, and they know it more clearly than we do." Now, fortunately, he was wrong, and the islands have recovered, and the population now is approaching 300,000. There are wealthy subsistence economies, but they are desperately, desperately cash poor and undeveloped. They're not a paradise, and they need understanding and help from the world community to help them develop these beautiful, warm, fertile islands so that they can have a future and their young people can have a future. a rather sad picture to end with. Well, not quite, because we've got one more slide. I went back to Vanuatu and Malekula in 2011, a little over 3 years after I'd left. And here's my lovely truck, my beautiful brand new Mitsubishi L200 four-wheel drive truck, up on blocks, cannibalized for parts, and no doubt will never, never move again. And this is one of the problems of the islands. When pieces of kit are donated, they're not provided with spare parts and with a supply chain, with maintenance capabilities to keep things running. I've traveled around the islands so much and saw so many donated pieces of kits, water pumps, solar panels, wind turbines, which have been provided as a piece of capital plant, but have then gone into decline and dereliction for a lack of parts and a lack of maintenance. It has to be a more comprehensive and integrated pattern of aid that we provide, along the lines of France's Popaka project in the cocoa, if you remember, that provided means of production, means of processing, means of transport, and means of retailing at the far end. It's integrated. It's not just a bit of kit purchased, left, but left sadly to decline. And then a final picture was the house that I always wanted to own in Malekula. This is just south of the capital. A beautiful sandy beach is just behind me, and a nice bit of open ground going back towards some coconut palms, and then feeding up into the rainforest on the hills behind. What better place could there be to live? So that is the end of my talk. I thank you for listening to me. I thank Stromness Museum for giving me the opportunity to make this talk. Above all, I thank my friends and colleagues in Vanuatu and the people of Vanuatu who made me so welcome and gave me an experience which is one of the highlights of my life. And I certainly intend to go back as soon as the COVID restrictions allow me to do so. I would have gone in 2020 if this hadn't happened to us. And I so look forward now to getting back as soon as I can. So I will now stop sharing and say goodbye to you all. And there may be an opportunity to ask questions. I'm hoping we'll have a question and answer session, which can follow on as a separate thing from this recorded talk. So I'm now going to stop recording. Thank you very much indeed.